well, that'll stop them from doing something dangerous. But it's never meant to be a permanent state. At most, if it's used at all, um, it's a temporary thing. And then it's up to you to rebuild that bridge immediately. Immediately. I was, oh, when I yelled at you, you felt really bad. Yeah. That was really scary when I screamed at you. Yeah. That rebuilds the bridge. What happens is that when parents, either deliberately or inadvertently, invoke, or say, evoke the shame state in the child, and then they don't repair it, then they make the child repair the bridge. You can talk to me when you apologize or when you're good again. Now you're making it the child's responsibility to rebuild the bridge. And that's what evokes the long-term shame. That's just a very simple, straightforward example. In abuse, it's even more severe because in abuse, what actually happens is an overactivation of the parasympathetic nervous system because to evoke the sympathetic nervous system would mean that the child would fight or would escape. That's not an option. So it has to be immobilization in the midst of being hurt. Our normal response to a threat of being hurt ought to be help seeking, escape, or resistance. But we can't do that when we're being abused and we're helpless. And typically, the abused person takes on the shame and in two ways. One is a deep sense that somehow I caused this or invited it or allowed it to happen. Well, that it's my fault that it happened. It's my very self because children take things personally so that if these terrible things are happening, I must be a terrible person. And then there's shame about not fighting back. And so often, I've been in situations where people 7 or 6 decades later recall being abused and being ashamed of themselves for not fighting back. When in fact, the immunization was the only thing that could have saved them. So they're ashamed of the very dynamic that actually saved their lives. And it's so important to teach people that. Of course, shame being an overactivation of parasympathetic nervous system is also a physical state. And the psychological hallmark is this deep sense that I don't belong and that even in a crowd, I am uniquely alone. So a couple of the people who sent in questions and that I may work with can feel alone even in the middle of this crowd, even in the middle of a crowd that is mostly benign or designatedly benign. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Just raise your hand. All these lonely people, right? Where do they all come from? All these lonely people. Where do they all belong? You know that song by Paul McCartney, Eleanor Rigby. So, no, when people ask, why do I feel ashamed of, somebody says being a single mom, somebody says having multiple sclerosis, somebody relates the shame to their queerness. Um, I was going to say something about that, but rather than just tell you, let's just see what happens if we work with it. So, number of people sent in questions. Thank you. These are not picked in order of value, or if I don't pick you, you shouldn't be ashamed of yourself. It's not because you or your questions wasn't good enough. Um, but just one final comment. Shame very much has to do with either how we look to other people or how we perceive we look to other people. So, actually, I went through quite a deep experience of it um, uh, about, I guess, a year and a half ago now, um, when I interviewed Prince Harry, and there was all this media storm around it. And I'm not going to go into the details. It was a good talk. I wish I hadn't agreed to how it was conducted. Um, and I had this deep shame afterwards that I looked bad, I let everybody down, and all this kind of stuff, you know. And um, and I every once in a while I actually get desperate enough to ask for help, you know. And how desperate can you get, you know? And so I called, in this case, Dan Siegel. I said, Dan, I'm just going through something. Can you help me? No, inability to seek help is one of the hallmarks of shame. If you got shame and if you can ask for help, you're in a good spot. It's that I can't even ask for help, or there's no help, or I deserve help, or I should be able to handle this myself. That's crippling. So anyway, Dan and I talked, and Dan said, well, what is it about what's going on that upsets you so much? Um, I mean, and it's interesting how deeply I got caught up in it, because usually I don't care that much what the media says or what it doesn't say. But I said to him, it's that they don't see me. They're not, they don't see me. I don't mind being criticized for what I do or what I say, but I want to be seen. And she says, well, he said, Dan said, yeah, well, not being seen almost cost you your life when you were an infant, didn't it? I said, yeah, that was the end of it. You know, and so literally, when you think you're ashamed of this, that, or the other, no, you're not. You're ashamed of yourself, because at some point, you got the message um, that you weren't acceptable and you didn't belong. So that's the source of it. Somehow you got that message.